Hey there, Engraver here, and welcome back to my SNES soundtrack series, where we again will focus on the Donkey Kong Country soundtracks. This video is dedicated to the bonuses and boss fights. Let's begin. We'll start with the bonus room Blitz. For structure, I give it a 10 out of 10. The length is 28 seconds. Now the length is short, but that's okay. You're in and out of the bonus environments pretty quick. We've got this nice one-bar intro before sending the player into the game. There's a combination of an A and B melody, and each melody is 4 bars in length, followed by a non-pitched percussive outro that leads the player back to the beginning of the loop. For instrumentation, I give it a 10 out of 10. There's a return on the jungle instruments, including drums, a wooden flute synth, and some simian chattering. The percussion is nice and fast, keeping the player on their toes for the challenge. There's this terrific low end with an ultra-low bass, which can be nicely mistaken for a low drum. This particular register was a good call because bass instruments represents DK's heavyweight nature. For mood, I give it a 10 out of 10. The mood is upbeat and happy, and this at times contrasts the more serious soundtracks like Aquatic Ambience and Misty Menace. That's important because it steers the player to a new environment with a different kind of challenge. The overall mix is a 10 out of 10. It's nice and tight between the low, mid, and high instruments. The bass is at a very low register, but it doesn't distort or muddy up the rest of the instruments. There's this great delay that adds a little girth to the upbeat rhythm. So this brings us to a total score of 40 out of 40, or 100%. Bad Boss Boogie is next. For structure, I give it a 9 out of 10. The length is sitting at 1 minute and 8 seconds. This is a good length for a piece that carries the player through dramatic musical suspension. That said, the boss fights never last as long as the musical loop. Now, despite this composition having no significant melody, there's a great symmetry in the rhythm and the harmony. At every 4 bars, you are moving up chromatically and very incrementally, meaning the shift in harmony is very small. Now, I would have marked the score down 1 additional point, only because there's no real turn of the last phrase before you loop back to the beginning. Now, there is a nice extension concluding the loop, but it doesn't smoothly resolve. But I guess that's part of the effect, that tense atmosphere. For instrumentation, I give it a 10 out of 10. The instrumentation is limited but impactful. You have this simple bass line that homophonically follows the harmony synths. You've got this nice use of non-pitched percussion that gives off this industrial vibe, which is an important feature of the Kremlings, who are the antithesis of DK's natural surroundings. There's an eerie flute synth hanging over all the musical activity, and it complements the rhythm further down, before disappearing in the concluding section of the composition. For mood, I give it a 10 out of 10. The mood is tense because of the chromatic ascension and musical suspense. There's this relentless percussion that keeps the blood pumping. And this is perfect because all you want is to beat that bad guy so you can get on to the next area. The overall mix is an 8 out of 10. The mix is good, but the delay effect in the high-pitched percussion kind of muddies it up. This is due to the music already being highly active. There's no rest or turn of a musical phrase, which doesn't give the player any aural breathing room. Remove the delay and you'd have a tighter sound. Now, you need this tighter sound because of the sound effects in a given boss fight. All your enemies have their own signature sound effect. That, with the sounds involving our heroes, heavily competes with the soundtrack. So this brings us to a total score of 37 out of 40, or 93%. And finally, we have Gangplank Galleon. For structure, I give it an 11 out of 10. The length is sitting at 1 minute and 45 seconds. This is a terrific length for such a boss fight. The fight goes through a few rounds of activity between DK and his reptilian nemesis K. Rool. and the soundtrack has enough length where it doesn't feel repetitive. The one extra point is for the best intro ever. You have this 1-bar intro with a quirky hold on a 5 chord. Then we have another 4-bar phrase in the major key before it gets into a 4-bar conclusion that switches to the parallel minor key. In this case, from D major to D minor. For instrumentation, I give it a 10 out of 10. The synths reflect the seaside pirate environment superbly. We have this great bass line that leads into the main section and melody. We've got this iconic flute synth that thus far has represented DK's simian nature. Now it represents the piratic atmosphere brought to us by the Kremlins. For mood, I give it a 10 out of 10. This is a wonderful boss fight for the king pirate feel that we see with King K. Rool. I love the contrast between the major key in the beginning with its sea shanty to its parallel minor key signaling that things are about to get real. The overall mix is an 8 out of 10. It's a great mix, but I would say that the low end in the percussion is a little heavy. It could have been lighter because there are cannons involved in this fight, so the added sound effects really muddies it up. Now I know that David Wise worked with delay as a rhythmic element, but there are times where it's just too much. It's always important to consider what sound effects are competing with the soundtrack. I would say also that the panning on the weak beats is way too far at the right ear. Something more centered would have been preferable. That said, there are no points docked for this because it's a good enough mix for a TV monitor. So this brings us to a total score of 39 over 40 or 98%. I hope you enjoyed the score and assessment of these great DKC soundtracks. And until I see you next, keep producing or preserving the great music you love.